the title of my presentation, Future of European Security in a Time of Strategic Discontinuity. We're all very much aware of the economic discontinuity which has just hit all of us to varying degrees since sometime last year. But in the strategic realm, in the realm of security, we are possibly even more so than in the economic arena in an era of discontinuity, what in French we call rupture stratégique. And this this form of words is one which the white paper in France has been very largely built upon. Now, why did we choose that expression? Why did we give it its pivotal importance? And here I will sort of line up in telegraphic form the reasons which have the manner in which we have characterized the security situation. First of all, there is a greater potential for systemic disruption in the world. This is a companion consequence of globalization. Every single event, every single crisis has ab initio, and I emphasize the ab initio part of the sentence, ab initio a potential to go global. Why? Because anything and everything can travel. Now, in practice, mercifully, this does not happen often. There are many reasons why all local problems do not become global problems. But ab initio, the potential is there. And that is a significant difference from some of the previous historical situations that we have known, including that which we knew during the Cold War. Secondly, because of the numerous connectivities which characterize globalization, because those connectivities are global, the nature of security challenges which we will be facing becomes multidimensional. Now, let me give just two practical examples. One, SARS, 2003. A virus emerges somewhere in southwest China. Within a few weeks, it affects neighboring countries in the region. And within another few weeks, you have major economic disruption at the level of the East Asian region and the potential for a global pandemic with hotspots breaking out, notably in Canada. Had the epidemic continued, it would have moved from the realm of economic disruption to becoming a security problem. Because after all, nasty little virus had a 15% lethality rate. So you can imagine what happens when you have large numbers of people who are infected. Another example, Katrina. And I'm very deliberately here picking non-intentional events. Because of course if they're intentional, it's even easier to make the demonstration. You take Katrina, hurricane, affects a city. Well, this is a meteorological event. Has consequences on the daily lives of people who live in a city. Not a security issue. Except that after a few days they had to send in the 82nd Airborne. The same division, the same American unit which was parachuted onto Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. Not a security problem? That's very interesting. In the age in which we live, crises of any proportion tend to have several dimensions. Third point, the severity of crises, all other things being equal, will tend to be greater today and tomorrow than it was yesterday. Why? More people, more concentrated people, more urbanization, and you throw on top of everything else the environmental and the ecological consequences of human activity on the globe. Katrina happening 2 centuries ago would have gone essentially unnoticed, except by the 15,000 people who were living in New Orleans at the time. Well, in 2005 it was a rather different situation. And this is a systematic characteristic. The tsunami, 2004, killed more than 200,000 people, massively disrupted lives and livelihoods in a vast region. A similar event, which occurred in 1883 in the same region, killed 5 times fewer people and did not cause regional disruption on anything like the same scale. 4th point. Well, it's a multipolar world. That's a descriptive point. It's not a prescriptive point. I'm not at all. I'm not a proponent of multipolarity. I don't think actually multipolarity is particularly good for the world, because it makes for greater unpredictability in the handling of crises and the dispensation of security. But it is a multipolar world, with the rise of Asia being the most impressive. A single most important characteristic of that multipolar world. We can talk about that in the Q&A, China and India and so on. But it's a multipolar world, but not like the world of the 19th century, which was also multipolar. But in the 19th century it was a multipolar world of states. Today of strong states. Today we have a multipolar world of comparatively weak states. What do I mean by a comparatively weak state? I'm not saying that statehood as such is in decline. Indeed, if it were, one would wonder why so many people want to claim it. Secondly, only states continue, and I think will continue, to have the ability to exercise a permanent broad-spectrum power over a given territory and population, but comparatively weaker states because of the importance of the role played by non-state actors. This is a much more crowded stage than the one which existed in previous centuries. And this, of course, includes all manner of non-state actors. Non-state actor is a negative description. It essentially tells you what something is not. But you'll have Benetton, and you'll have Bin Laden. You'll have McDonald's, and you'll have Greenpeace, and they're all very different, each from the other. This is a world in which power to build and power to destroy is spread around much more than it used to be, including at the extremes of violence. 9/11, more people were killed in New York and Washington on 9/11 2001 than Americans were killed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. That's quite a step change in the comparative ability of actors to non-state actors to appropriate powers which were not accessible to non-state actors until then. And it is no longer possible to exclude the possibility that non-state actors may acquire the ultimate means of destruction, weapons of mass destruction. 5th point, security challenges are no longer meeting security challenges. It's something which is no longer usefully structured by the traditional external, internal paradigm. You have the external stuff, state versus state, or state with state, and the internal stuff, which is intrastate. No, if you have a pandemic, it's going to be all of the above. If you have 9/11, it's going to be all of the above. Because of the multidimensional nature of security challenges which I referred to earlier, because of the cross-border nature of many of these challenges, making the age-old distinction between the people who handle external relations be they of forceful nature or of a diplomatic nature on the one hand, and those who handle domestic contingencies on the other, that is no longer a doctrinally useful distinction to be made. I will caveat that a bit further down in my exposition, but it is but the principle is that you're no longer going to be able to structure the state usefully around the notion that there is a stark, everyday opposition, distinction between external and internal. Similarly, the paradigm that intentional threats to security are basically different from non-intentional security risks, that is no longer a useful paradigm either. Sure, ministers will tell you that in political terms it won't be the same to handle a bio attack than it would be to handle a purely natural pandemic. True enough, in some ways. The politics are going to be somewhat different. In one case, you're going to have an identifiable causal enemy in the form of human beings whom you're going to be able to get at, hopefully. On the other hand, you're going to be dealing with an enemy who does not belong to the human condition, the virus or whatever. But the tools that you will use, the organizations that you will use, and the doctrine which inspires the organizations which you'll use in practice are going to be the same. You are going to have an Allhazards approach. The bottom line to that analysis, in which led us to this expression, this rupture strategique, is that, well, first of all, we have to assume that there will be less predictability than there used to be, greater severity than there used to be, and that there will be, and this is a bit of a paradox, more indivisibility to security than there used to be. You remember that old expression during the Cold War, which we all used at the time, which was, international security is indivisible. And this notion underpinned the multilateral attempts to get at the causes of insecurity. And the conditions of the Cold War, this happened to be true. After the Cold War, we tended to move away from the indivisibility paradigm because, well, many crises did remain local. When there was a genocide in Rwanda, it was a genocide in Rwanda. One should have done more about it than one did. But the fact is, it didn't have major implications outside of its immediate region at the time. And the same can be said for many other crises. But today, in the age of globalization, it is imprudent to assume that security is divisible. And that, of course, has implications in the way you're going to organize yourself, not only in security terms, but also in diplomatic terms. And here I'd like to move to the doctrinal consequences, then to the organizational consequences, and then some words about Europe, the European dimension. Doctrinal consequences, well, the first consequence is that you're going to have to organize for unpredictability. And here I can't resist picking a few sentences from a very remarkable piece by Samuel Britton in today's FT, which made the point very nicely, because when I tell people one has to organize for unpredictability, often the reaction is, but how can we organize since things are unpredictable? Well, A, they never were fully predictable anyway. So it's a weak cop-out to say that one should not organize for unpredictability because one cannot. But of course we do it every day. And here is what Samuel Britton says. Rather than rely on long-term Weather Bureau predictions, he was thinking about Ireland when he wrote this, I'm sure. Rather than rely on long-term Weather Bureau predictions, it is safer to take an umbrella or raincoat and a warm pullover, as well as sunglasses and a sunshade. Well, maybe that wasn't Ireland. Even at the cost of slightly heavier luggage. Now apply this homely little story to, in his words, economic policy. Well, you can apply exactly the same story to strategic policy. So what does this mean? A, you're going to give a very high premium to early warning. Anything which allows you to have, as soon as possible, some idea of what may hit you is going to be very strongly rewarded. Had the WHO, the World Health Organization, picked up the SARS virus a couple of weeks before it actually did, well, instead of having a sudden and massive economic shutdown for 3 months in East Asia and about 1,000 people killed, well, the damage would have been somewhat less. You may not be able to predict the future, but you can at least try and keep track of the present. So cross-disciplinary information gathering and processing, knowledge-based security, which is the formula I've been using in English to talk about what we in French have called connaissance et anticipation, horizon scanning, to use an expression from the folks in Singapore who worked quite hard on these issues. That is going to be a function of the state in its role as a provider of security, which is going to have to be more emphasized in the future than it has been in the past. Secondly, there's going to be a premium given to the ability to bring together, for decision-making and planning purposes, all security and defense actors in the framework of an all-hazards approach. That expression, all-hazards approach, we picked very deliberately from the work done by our friends in the UK, notably the work done by Sir David Omand when he came up with this doctrine back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Since you're going to be using the same planning tools and the same management tools, well, you're also going to organize the decision-making process within the state as a consequence. And I'll come to that in a second. Thirdly, given the world in which we live, with its numerous connectivities, difficult to understand, the rise of Asia, the weakening of the role of the state compared to the role of other actors, and so on, we're going to have to be much more deliberate in terms of selecting participation in foreign operations, military operations, whatever their nature, be it peacekeeping operations, peace support operations, or main force intervention. I'm not saying less or fewer, or I'm simply saying we're going to have to be much more deliberate about it. Fourth, there's going to be an absolutely major premium to all of those measures which contribute to the resilience of society. We are not going to be able to divine the future any more than we've been able to do so in the past. Indeed, we may be even less able to do so than in the past, because when we try to pick up weak signals, we're meeting ever higher levels of noise, because that also comes with globalization. The amount of spurious signals, the amount of background noise is such that it's to find that virus, to come back to the SARS picture in southwest China, well, it's going to become more difficult, not easier in the future, because of just the sheer amount of data which you're going to have to process. We are not going to be able to avert all blows. We can soften them. We can organize ourselves to mitigate their effects upon us, and we can organize ourselves to rebound from the blows that we have received. Organizing oneself for graceful degradation, to use an expression from the engineering world. Resilience, by the way, also comes from the engineering world. Those are doctrinal points, but they carry practical organizational consequences, and I'll simply pick up those which we have taken in France. First of all, the emphasis on information. Well, we've set up a National Intelligence Council. That's maybe not be earth-shaking, but we didn't have one before. We created the position of National Intelligence Coordinator. We're in the process of setting up an advisory body drawn from people who are not currently active within the bureaucracy to provide the cross-disciplinary, non-turf related input, if I can put it that way, in the exploitation of an interpretation of information. And I use information rather than intelligence, because intelligence is part of information, but information is a much broader category. The institutions and the money. We're in the process of, in essence, doubling the resources made available to our intelligence, security, and related services. I would also add that this is the world which I described may in some ways appear to be rather daunting. But in another way, it's a world which also plays to the comparative advantages of the industrialized world. What do I mean? Globalization, as it has unfolded since the word itself was invented a bit more than close to 50 years ago now, is driven by the development of information technology. You all know Moore's law, the amount of information which can be processed on a given surface of silicon, doubles every 18 months, all other facts remaining equal. And that, what's an empirical law? It's not a scientific law, but it is an empirical law. It has held good now since 1970, and its potential has not played out yet. That in practical terms means that this is an area in which the absolute costs involved in dealing with information in all of the meanings of word dealing, in terms of gathering, in terms of processing, in terms of interpreting, in terms of distributing, and so on, those costs are going very rapidly downwards. This is a very different field than the field, let's say, of hardware, of military hardware purchases. You know, ask the British military what they think about the cost of the Eurofighter, for example, and well, you'll notice that the costs are somewhat higher than that of the previous generation aircraft, which itself is much higher than that of the generation before. In the field of information, it's the exact opposite. The cost of a high-performance spy satellite today, in our experience, national experience, is about 1/10 of what it was 15 years ago, and going down. It's going down so rapidly that even small countries can play, like Taiwan or South Korea or Israel. These are not giant countries in terms of the resources of their resource base. So it's fortunate that what we require is information in all of its forms, because information is something at which we're all quite good at dealing with. I close that parenthesis. Secondly, in terms of the decision-making, bringing together all facets of national security, defense and non-defense. Well, in France, we used to have a presidentially chaired body called the Defense Council, which dealt with defense planning, defense doctrine decisions on the one hand, and we had an Interior Security Council also at the presidential level. Well, these have been merged. We now have a national defense and a defense and national security council as a decision-making body. This is not a French version of the NSC. In the Q&A, we can discuss why we haven't created an American-style NSC. But we have brought together those decision-makers. Here I open a parenthesis. This obviously does not mean and must not mean that the bodies which implement policy, the military, the police, and so on, that these bodies are going to be brought together in terms of their standard operating procedures. Of course not. The relationship between the military and the use of force has been, is, and must remain intrinsically different from the relationship which the police has in terms of its relationship towards the use of force. And this may be even, this is something we have to be even more careful about today than in the past, precisely because we find ourselves in situations where it can be very tempting to get into a confusion des genres. I mentioned the military and the police. Well, take something even more extreme. Who would normally in his right mind say the military and a humanitarian NGO are the same thing? But in practice, look at the pressure under which our military come in PKOs and similar operations to fulfill those roles which one would normally have expected government, development, or humanitarian assistance, or non-governmental humanitarian associations, organizations to fulfill. One has to be even more careful than in the past to make sure that we don't confuse the missions, the roles of the various actors, because because circumstances make it impossible to do otherwise, if we are led to enter into such confusion, that we do so in an extremely deliberate and open-eyed manner. That is, that we actually know what we're doing. As I say, there can be situations where this becomes unavoidable. But it's certainly not something that one should be looking for, and indeed one should be looking for the exact opposite. And that I would add is not the flavor of the day. The flavor of the day is get boots on the ground and do nation building with them. Well, I didn't realize the military was supposed to do nation building. Usually shoot stuff and destroy. Allhazards approach. We are in the process of setting up a national crisis management center. This is not a very original initiative. The Brits have shown us the way here. In this particular field, as I said, we drew a fair amount of inspiration, both doctrinal and organizational, from the Brits. They've got COBRA, the Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. When I look at the occasions on which COBRA has been opened, when you open up COBRA, it's a signal that what is going on is important. That in itself, all alarm bells ring in Whitehall when you open up COBRA, and all hands on the deck. That's what it means. Well, we had one case of a lethal virus escaping from a research laboratory in southeast England. Then they opened COBRA because of floods, major floods. They had opened COBRA some time before because of the attempts, the terrorist operations in London. All hazards, some intentional, some unintentional, and some at the limit. That is, when a research laboratory is a thing run by human beings. If a virus escapes, it may not be intentional, but it certainly is man-made. So all three categories are handled. What I very briefly described, in a way, sounds pretty obvious, or should sound pretty obvious. But believe me, the bureaucratic resistance involved is, and understandably so, fairly obvious. When you ask people to work together in frameworks to which they are not used to working together in, and indeed on issues on which they have not been used to work together, well, that implies a lot of very hard pushing, a lot of political support. On the question of foreign military operations, in France, we used to be in, from the executive standpoint, a very happy situation, one in which essentially the president could say, okay, let's send the Foreign Legion to southern Patagonia, and he didn't need to ask anybody's permission, and he could send whoever and for however long he wanted to, etc. We have now built inertia and I would add some democratic checks and controls into that system. If an operation lasts more than several months, there has to be an explicit authorizing vote from Parliament. Why did we do this? Why did the President want to do this? Which is a more interesting question, because this was not a recommendation which he resisted when we made it. Because I think there is a fairly broad understanding that more deliberateness has to be built into the manner in which we contemplate engaging our forces in foreign operations. And as I say, whatever the nature of those foreign operations, the whole range of tasks, from the softest PKO to the hardest rules of engagement. All of this to deal with the type of security environment which I mentioned. Now, I did not go into the specifics of the threats and of the risks, and we may want to do that more maybe in the Q&A, but I'll simply give a very brief checklist. What is one talking about? The threat of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction by states or by non-state actors. One is talking also about the re-emergence which comes along with the appearance of a multipolar world of great power rivalry. I don't know what East Asia will look like in 10 or 20 years' time. I do know what the Middle East looks like, and doesn't look pretty in terms of the security challenges which may be thrown up in that region. Third category, bioterrorism and non-intentional pandemics. State failure, familiar one for all of us, PKOs we have to get involved in. Last but definitely not least, the prospect of war breaking out, either generated by initially domestically driven circumstances or by interstate conflict in the Middle East, in the energy-rich Middle East. I would add that in the French case, for the first time, we actually drew, in the most literal sense of the word to draw, we drew what for us is the strategic axis, which we consider to be the one which dimensions the force requirements for a Ministry of Defense, which essentially runs from the western approaches of the Atlantic, seen from the French standpoint, a bit more to the south than your western approaches of the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, down the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean, and back into the Persian Gulf. The ability to operate in that region, in that broad region, is what is dimensioning our basic force and equipment choices. The European dimension. And I'll conclude with the European dimension. I would want us to be able to have something of a discussion. Well, the European dimension is, of course, only one of the dimensions of operating in the new security context. First thing that one can do and should do is obviously get one's domestic, one's national doctrine and organization right. And the answer from state to state is obviously not going to be identical. South Korea is not going to have is not going to draw the same conclusions as France or Ireland or whatever even from an identical or potentially identical reading of the global security context. Secondly, well, here's where the European dimension comes in. Of course, where there is shared geography, and one of the most basic definitions of Europe is shared geography, then it makes sense to have joint and in some cases common policies, and I'll come to that in a second. Third dimension, when you have a shared economic and social fabric. I mentioned South Korea, I didn't mention Somalia. South Korea, Ireland, or France tend to have, in some ways, comparable economic and social fabrics. There will be a fairly high level of commonality in some doctrinal and organizational choices as a result of that fabric, and very different choices because of massive differences in capacity and need, of course, in those countries which do not belong to the old or new industrialized world. The industrialized world meaning essentially OECD plus some of the emerging economies which are not yet members of OECD. And third, of course, the last, of course, the fact that we're all part of the same world, the global dimension, which calls for global norms, but which also calls for an attitudinal change. You remember our old friend Don Rumsfeld, the Iraqi era. He coined an expression at the time, before Iraq, but just after 9/11. He said, "The mission determines the coalition." That, I would add, shocked many members of the integrated countries of NATO, who always thought that it's the coalition which dictated the mission. But it happened that Don Rumsfeld, who, however dangerous his policies may sometimes have turned out to be, was a man who tended to be quite good with words. He was right. Yes, the mission does determine the coalition. And we are in a world in which missions tend to vary immensely for the reasons which I've indicated before. But one could broaden Don Rumsfeld's proposition. It's not simply that the mission determines the coalition, it's the mission determines the institutions. The tools, the institutions and the mix of institutions which are going to be the most germane, the most relevant to a given crisis. You are not going to, when you're going to have SARS, as we did in 2003, the pivot of the coalition is going to be the World Health Organization, as it has been in the latest outbreak of so-called swine flu. And of course, for other courses, one will use other horses. But that does mean, in practice, that we're going to have to pay more attention as tools of international security to agencies which one had not classically associated with that notion. Now, the role of the EU in all of this, as such. Well, first of all, the EU, whatever its other weaknesses or limitations, the EU has a very strong capability to set norms, to set standards. Where did Kyoto come from? It came from the EU. Would there have been R2P, the responsibility to protect, if there hadn't been the impetus of the EU? Of course, it wasn't only the EU, but if the EU had not been in there substantially, I don't think we would have had R2P. Would there have been an international criminal court? I doubt it. We are quite good at setting norms and standards. Using, in the case of global security challenges implying a global approach, using the UN system. But the UN system not only as a source of legitimacy, which is something I certainly consider as being necessary while acknowledging all of the limitations of the UN for all of the reasons that we well know, but also the UN as a set of pilot agencies. I use the word pilot agencies because they're the ones who show the way. The WHO in case of sanitary issues, the IIEA, of course, in the nuclear arena, and so on. And to be much more deliberate in one's policy towards the actors of the system, the agencies of the system, and not simply towards the heart of the system, Security Council and so on. Secondly, second dimension of EU involvement, well, since the external and the internal dimensions of security can no longer be in intellectual terms and doctrinal terms set apart as they used to be, well, one cannot but note that the EU actually has a fairly large number of instruments which give it the ability to operate as a collective actor and not simply as the common denominator at a given moment of the member states of the Union in terms of internal security. Justice, liberty, security. Well, look at, you take the common arrest warrant. That's quite something. It's a dimension of security policy. Ask the anti-terrorist guys what they think about it. Well, they'll say, yes, it's an important tool. Is this and it is part of the EU fabric, not simply the intergovernmental fabric. Ditto to some extent with the crisis management of non-intentional events, firefighting, environmental catastrophes, the flooding in Germany. In all of these cases, yes, Brussels has been able to play a role. A role within limitations, because these are non-intentional events, and the capabilities which have been used have remained confined to that arena. Thirdly, ESDP. ESDP, I know it has been the source of debate in this country. I won't cover that debate. Javier Solana has done it, so I'm not going to play his role, I promise. But for me, ESDP remains limited for a very inherent reason, and that is, it is an intergovernmental construct. What it decides, what it does, is the fruit of the deliberations of nation states who remain the full masters of their foreign and security and defense policies. They will agree on occasion that operating under the blue flag is smarter than operating in other guises, whether national or under other coalitions, like NATO or indeed the UN flag. But it is a very classical, very traditional intergovernmental coalition. And this is an inherent limit because of the nature of what the European Union is. The European Union is in a way an upside-down or an inside-out federation. We are highly federalized on all sorts of issues, except for those which in other federations tend to be the ones in which the federation really exists. You take India, you take Brazil, you take Switzerland, you take the United States. What is truly federalized? Defense, security policy, external security policy, and diplomacy. As for the rest, well, I was talking about the European arrest warrant. You don't have an American arrest warrant in the United States. Very complicated to get extraditions from state to state or from state to federal, to the federal level, if it hasn't been a clear federal crime, as they say in the United States. The genetic code of the European Union is clearly not going to change rapidly. There is a paradox in ESDP, a paradox which I don't like, and that is that the ESDP has, in the operations it has conducted, actually conducted more civilian operations than military operations, or purely military operations. This is fine. That's not a criticism, on the contrary. In other words, in the framework of ESDP, we're able, with difficulty and with limits, but we're able to bring together civil defense people, we're able to bring together judicial people, we're able to bring together development experts, all sorts of people whom you need to deal with a post-trauma situation. But we don't actually have that ability in the framework of within the European Union itself, in order to face a major man-made contingency. Now, the solidarity clause in theory offers us the possibility of building up that capability. But for the moment, to my knowledge, the only people who are really tasked to being able to do that are the folks which are dependent on the ESDP. Impact of Lisbon Treaty on what I have just described. For me, the biggest impact is the bringing together of the resources of the Council, such as they are. They're essentially political and in a minor sense financial, plus the ability, when the governments agree to do so, to throw in military and civilian people. On the one hand, with the resources, the very massive resources of the Commission when it comes to the ability to mobilize funding for development or humanitarian purposes, and having a high representative who should be able, under the terms of the treaty, to bring those two together, would actually be a much more powerful person than the one who is there today. In conclusion, well, I'm going to use the old formula: we all hang together or we hang separately. The kind of world in which I have described, this world of connectivities, this world of surprises, this world of systemic challenges, is one in which nation-states operating helter-skelter are not going to be very effective. So, we really have our work cut out for us to get our internal organization right, corresponding to the needs of each one of us, but then, of course, building the ability for those national organizations to work together, and in some cases, as is the case for some of the things we just talked about in the EU, in some cases to pool those assets. Well, I think we have a bit of time for the Q&A.